Good evening. I'd like to start tonight talking a little about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Yesterday was a day filled with announcements from both Russian and Ukrainian sources indicating that a threat or an attack on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant was imminent. There was even comments from the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, indicating that he had information or proof that the Russians had mined the roofs of some of the reactors in the Zap power plant. Now, today we've all woken up and there has been no attack. There's been no damage done that anyone is aware of to the Zaporizhzhia power plant. And there have been reports indicating satellite photographs showing that there has been no mining whatsoever of the reactor roofs in the plant. So this seems to directly contradict what Volodymyr Zelensky himself has claimed the Russians were doing in the power plant. I have read some other reports that perhaps there may have been some communication from the West to Zelensky to either request him or threaten him not to go ahead with any activity involving the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. I can't corroborate those reports, but it's something that I have seen. It is interesting as there was a lot of noise, and it was probably the top topic being spoken about Ukraine yesterday. Anyhow, at this stage, nothing has been done. Seems like saner, calmer, more mature minds have prevailed, and that those in charge have recognized that for whatever small benefits, short-term benefits there may have been by causing some dispute over the Zaporizhzhia plant, that the long-term impacts of that to Ukraine, Russia, and possibly surrounding nations really just wouldn't be worth that. So without that out of the way, I'd like to talk about a few things that have happened over the last 24 hours in the fighting in Ukraine. I'll cover off a couple of different areas. Rybar are reporting, Rybar have a Telegram channel. They seem to be quite reliable in their reporting. They're reporting about NOVO, SELOV, SKOYE, that there has been a Russian advance in that area. Reporting from Rybar was indicating that the Russians believe the Ukrainians would have to move forces south from Kremenia or move them down from the north in Kupiansk to the area around Novosibirsk, as the Ukrainian reserves or Ukrainian forces in that area are light, and the Russians are indicating they believe the Ukrainians only have enough there to just defend their current positions. If the Russians were to advance and push there, they believe that they will overwhelm the Ukrainians in that area. So we'll wait and see if the Ukrainians do reinforce, or if they perhaps start to adopt a more Russian tactic and give ground and fall back to some defensive positions that they may have prepared earlier behind there. Given the current tactics and the approach that the Ukrainians have taken over the last month during the offensive, it seems unlikely that they would fall back, given that they are trying, it seems quite desperately, to be able to report any sort of victory or claiming any new territory that they have control over. If the Russians are making a move here in Novosibirsk, then that will be interesting, because the Russians have been quiet in this area for a long time. They haven't made any pushes, and it may be an indication that the Russians are seeing some weakness there in the Ukrainian ability to come and reinforce that area. Now, if we move right over to the west, to Lvov, the city of Lvov is only about 60 kilometers away, maybe 45 miles away from the Polish border. There have been reports of some missile strikes there. Obviously, being this far away from the Russian front line and from the east of Ukraine, the Russians are are limited to striking this far out with long-range missiles, but these have been targeted strikes apparently on groupings of military personnel. Attacks this far west in Ukraine must make the Polish a little edgy, as it certainly shows them that the Russians can reach out that far if they wish to. Yeah, you would assume that these missiles have come from Russian territory, or at least Russian territory within Ukraine or the borders of Ukraine, and have travelled across Ukraine, and any air defence that has attempted to take them down has been unsuccessful. An area where the Ukrainians, though, do seem to be having some success is the area of Klishchiivka, which is just on the south flank of Artyomsk, which the Ukrainians refer to as Bakhmut, where from October last year we had 5 or 6 months of very heavy fighting to grind away, and for the Russians to eventually claim Bakhmut. Now, in the last week or so, the Ukrainians have been launching very heavy artillery strikes, have been concentrating their artillery around this area. Reports coming out from the military analysis channel on YouTube that the Ukrainians have been overwhelming the Russians' artillery around this area. Enough so that they're starting to make some advances around Klishchiivka. This is on the southern flank of Bakhmut or Artyomsk, and while the Russians are reporting that Klishchiivka still remains under Russian control, the reporting is that the Ukrainians have been launching fierce fighting there and have been able to shut down the Russian artillery in that area, and overwhelm it enough to be able to make some advances in that area. Now, as to whether they may be repelled by the Russians, we'll find out later on in the next few hours. One report, though, from the Ukrainians in this area is that they have video, there's video evidence of this, was that what they lost an American AN/MPQ 64 Sentinel radar. Now, these radar units are used for support of short-range missiles and things like NASAMS and Avengers. Now, the unit itself, if you Google online, the estimated cost of one of these AN/MPQ 64s is about $67 million. So if that is correct and one of these has been destroyed in that area, then that may perhaps reduce the Ukrainians' ability in this area to advance, as they would now be more susceptible to close air support from Russian air forces. There was definitely, so it seems to be, this video indicating some successful strikes on Russian ammo dumps. A couple of videos have come out of one in Avdiivka, just northeast of Donetsk. There was a video shot from within inside someone's house where a massive explosion goes off, and then a subsequent video has come out, which is from a loitering drone, and it's interesting as to what has actually caused the explosion. You don't see in the video, or I couldn't detect a missile coming in as such, and so it may even have been that a smaller device was used to trigger this. It may have been a small FPV drone dropping some grenade or something, but certainly it had the desired effect, and that Russian ammunition dump goes up like a box full of fireworks. Look, reporting around the Ukrainian air capabilities is not good. There's another report today of an Su-25 being shot down, and I think from memory that's the fourth report over the last 4 days of 4 separate Su-25s that the Russians are claiming to have shot down. One of them was apparently providing a support role for an Su-24 while the Su-24 was launching a Storm Shadow long-range missile. attack. The Su-24s have been modified to be able to deploy this British Storm Shadow, and this Su-25 was apparently providing support for it as it got into position to be able to launch that, and the Su-25 was taken out by Russian air defense. And to me, it seems as though this is sort of continuing and does paint a picture of Ukrainians losing air support ability for their ground forces as their Su-25s are slowly attrited away. On the other hand, I'm not seeing any reports of Russian aircraft being brought down. There was a report about 48 hours ago of perhaps of an Alligator, a KF-52 helicopter being brought down by the Ukrainians, but I didn't see more reporting on that. But that may well be the case. The Alligators are obviously very active at the moment, working on the Ukrainian armed vehicles, tanks, and that sort of thing. So, yeah, the Ukrainians losing another radar piece of equipment which supports their air defense is not going to help them, as they're also losing planes, it seems, at this stage. There's obviously a lot of talk of F-16s being supplied to Ukraine. However, it's quite possible, and I've read this reported by former F-16 pilots, that they would suffer the same fate in Ukraine at the moment due to the superiority of the Russian air defense capabilities. I read something yesterday that the S-400s aren't actually doing a great deal at this stage, because the S-300s and books and things like that are doing enough of the air defense that a lot of the Ukrainian attacks and planes aren't getting to, or missiles aren't getting to a point where the S-400s are being actively engaged very often. So you can imagine that F-16s flying into that area, coming up against some of the best air defense capabilities on the planet. And I think many people recognize that now, that the different ideologies between the West, the US, and Russia. The West has always had a policy of having air superiority, has invested in that and put their forces into ensuring that they have air superiority when they are directly engaged. The Russians, unable or unwilling to compete in the air superiority arena, have instead focused upon air defense, and so that's where their focus has gone. And that's now reports are coming out that, you know, a lot of people in the West now, military people in the West, are starting to give credit to these S-300s, S-350s and S-400 systems as being perhaps the best air defense systems operating at the moment. The S-350 was in the news a couple of weeks ago for its first autonomous takedown of a Ukrainian jet, where it uses some AI capability and operated in a fully autonomous mode. So without human intervention, was able to detect, track, and then ultimately destroy a Ukrainian fighter jet. The war isn't just being contained to the battlefield. Obviously, there has been reports from the Russian air forces that their satellite program is progressing on target. There have been announcements over about the last 6 or 7 months of, I think, 5 or 6 successful satellite launches. Now, many of these, you would suspect, are going up to play a military role and to provide information about the battlefield in Ukraine. Also, the field of cyber, one of the domains of modern warfare, the cyber warfare. There's a report that the somewhat unusual story that the State Statistics Service of Ukraine announced that they, due to a disruption of work, due to a cyber attack, they have suspended the supply of statistics. She sells seashells to authorities, including the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. So what data they were providing, wasn't made clear, but an indication that an internal Ukrainian governmental organisation has suffered a cyber attack and is unable to provide information to the military. So, all in all, not looking particularly good in Ukraine for the Ukrainians at the moment. Some advances, perhaps around Klishchiivka, but again, reports of heavy losses in making these advances. Now, if we look a little further abroad today, there's some interesting news articles coming out. One today reporting that 2 Russian Navy corvettes, the Gromsky and the Perfect, have just docked at Shanghai in China, and the Russian sailors were greeted with a banner with the words "Long live the Russia and China friendship." So this is just another example of the growing and strengthening relationship between Russia and China, and how that is extending well into the military domain, with Russian ships in Chinese ports as China conducts ongoing maneuvers and operations in the straits between China mainland and Taiwan. I think this also demonstrates to the West that this is quite a signal that not only is the Chinese Navy active in this area should military conflict flare up over Taiwan, but also I think this is a strong indication given by Xi and Putin to the West that it's quite possible that the Russians will also assist should China be involved in a stoush with the Americans over Taiwan, and having their naval ships so warmly welcomed does seem to indicate that. Further on the front of the global scene and how that's impacting things, the Council of Foreign Relations, which is a think tank in the United States, has just released a report entitled US-Taiwan Relations in a New Era. And there are some interesting revelations in this report from a US group. They concede that submarines would be a critical part of any US offensive to support Taiwan or repel China and mainland forces from Taiwan. However, there are long maintenance delays. They don't have enough submarines at the moment, and those that they do, many of them are in a position where undergoing maintenance takes months or years, and that this right now would leave the US in a position of risk if China were to decide to invade Taiwan at this time. They also, the authors of this report also revealed that the US industrial complex is not ready for conflict. Interestingly, they comment that the Ukraine conflict has revealed this and also exacerbated the problem, which I think if we read between the lines, shows that the US overestimated their successes and the speed with which they thought they would overcome Russia. So it's revealed to them that the industrial complex doesn't have the capacity at the moment to produce the sort of military equipment and ammunition, planes and long-range missiles and 155mm shells that are required to not only battle against the Russians and defeat the Russians, but also not enough for them to go and fight the Chinese. The final revelation in this article is that they believe that the current Department of Defense stocks of munitions is insufficient if America were to go to war with China, particularly in the area of their long-range missiles. So these This must be worrying for those in America who have been pushing up against China, given that if their internal think tanks are feeling that they lack the current level of supplies to be able to take China on, they don't have enough submarines, and those that they do are in under maintenance, then you do see that as being a risk, that if Xi Jinping did decide that he wanted to make a move on Taiwan now, that America might be in a very stretched position with one foot in Europe trying to fight a proxy war with Russia through Ukraine, and now, while apparently undersupplied, try to take on China. On China's part, Xi seems to be applying pressure to Taiwan to try to get the Taiwanese to simply submit without a fight, with the large-scale naval maneuvers that go on around Taiwan, with the Chinese jets and amphibious landings and all of this just on their doorstep. It must be applying a lot of pressure, such that some people in Taiwan, I'm sure, will be starting to say, we're just going to accept the one China rule. We're up against a Godzilla here. We're better off to just accept that and not get ourselves invaded and be fought over. Because again, while the US say that they may support Taiwan, that may just prolong the destruction of Taiwan if a fight occurs there, in much the same way as even Dmitry Medvedev has stated. The simple way to stop the war in Ukraine is for the West to stop giving weapons to Ukraine. And there is truth in that. If that did happen, then very quickly the fighting would stop. The damage to Ukraine would stop. I don't think the Russians really wish to be wasting resources on fighting their way across Ukraine. I think if the Ukrainians were to stop and negotiate, the Russians would negotiate. Ukraine would be in a far worse off position than had they negotiated back in March of 2022, when allegedly there were negotiated terms of settlement underway and being written up, and this was likely to go ahead until Boris Johnson travelled to Ukraine and talked Zelensky out of negotiating with the Russians, and reportedly offered him all of the Western support he would ever need to be able to defeat Russia. It seems like what Boris has offered hasn't been, at least yet, been able to be fulfilled, as we see the Ukraine and Western nations indicating now that the offensive has not gone to plan. The Austrian military, Colonel Marcus Resner from the Austrian Armed Forces, he stated in an interview that he believes that phase one of the Ukrainian offensive has failed, and that this has been due to employing NATO techniques and tactics which fail against the Russian artillery and air superiority which they hold at the moment. There have been a lot of reports that the Russian artillery outweighs the Ukrainians 10 to 1 in the number of pieces they have able to fire. Also, the Russian supplies of artillery shells are far stronger than what the West is able to provide to Ukraine, and this is demonstrated by the amount of rounds fired per day, where the Ukrainians are getting down to levels of 1,000 shells a day being fired, and the Russians are still routinely sitting at 6,000-7,000 shells being fired a day, and going up above that when they need to. This colonel from the Austrian Armed Forces, he does believe, and again we're seeing this, that a change in tactics from the Ukrainians will come, and we are seeing that now, where they're not sending out the big columns of tanks and armoured vehicles into minefields, and are instead sending out smaller groups, special operations groups, trying to get behind Russian forces where they can and disrupt supply lines. There was some video footage today of a successful Russian special operation where allegedly during the night the Russians had got in and had mined a road behind a Ukrainian position, and the footage is, it's quite devastating war footage, but it shows a an armoured vehicle stopping, loading up, about 10 Ukrainians running from their positions into the loaded vehicle to be rotated out. And as it leaves and seems to turn onto a road to start its exit away, the armoured vehicle hits a mine, and it's destroyed. I imagine all of the poor blokes inside of it were destroyed as well. But it's those sort of operations, I think, now that we're seeing more from that. Well, that was the Russians performing it, but the Ukrainians attempting to do the same sort of thing, the sabotage things, because the full frontal attacks are just not being successful at this stage. We still have to remember all of these advances which we're talking about, the Ukrainians making at the moment, are still in what's known as the grey zone or the crumple zone. They haven't reached the really strong lines of Russian defence yet. So to make a real advance and get through there, the casualties will be very high. I've seen more reports just yesterday of a group of about 30 or 40 Ukrainian men arguing with their commander and just saying, no, they're not going out. They're not going out to fight. They're not going out to die. It's a suicide mission. I mean, you feel for people like that. You know, a lot of these, from these reports, a lot of these people are quite possibly recently conscripted into the army. I'm not a military person. I've never been in the armed forces. I can't imagine the stress, of being conscripted, taken off the street, taken away from your family, forced to go and fight, minimal training, when you're probably well aware of what your chances are. So yeah, this group had effectively banded together and were saying no, they wouldn't fight. So issues like that, morale is bad. It makes me wonder why this is still going on. Why, it makes me wonder what Zelensky and some of the West think they will achieve here. This offensive has not gone well for the Ukrainians. They've used up a lot of supplies, a lot of resources, a lot of material and equipment. A negotiated settlement now would be the best thing for Ukraine, to save any more Ukrainians and any Russians, just to save any more people being killed over what is probably slowly going to become less and less of Ukraine under Ukrainian control. And it boggles my mind so much that sometimes I actually wonder if the people who are really driving this from the West actually care about Ukraine at all, or if they are just solely focused on the money laundering and washing of money and weapons and contracts through to, major weapons suppliers, and that the plight of Ukraine as a nation is secondary to that. I hope that's not the case. And I might just finish on something which is maybe a little bit lighter note, or maybe not. Sort of around the topic of free speech. Jordan Peterson. Many people who watch this will know Jordan Peterson. He's very, very famous. He was a clinical psychologist and a professor in Canada, and rose to fame in about 2016 when there was a bill being introduced to Canada which was going to effectively make it compulsory for you to use someone's preferred pronouns. So if someone, let's pick a scenario here. If someone was male and biologically male, but they felt that they were female and they wished to be called she or her, then in Canada you were going to be compelled to say that, whether you felt that that person was a real woman or not. And so he had some disputes with students at the university, and this sort of thrust Peterson to fame. And now he's very, very famous. However, he posted on Twitter a screenshot from a message he'd received from YouTube, and the post was about an interview with Helen Joyce, which is titled "Trans When Ideology Meets Reality." And the message from YouTube was that video has been permanently struck from YouTube servers. for breaching their hate speech standards. So look, I don't know. Me speaking about this now, I wonder, I'm so small in the YouTube ecosystem, I wonder if anyone will care, or I wonder if I will get some sort of mention that I shouldn't be speaking about this. Interesting to see. I'll let you know. If I'm not here tomorrow, you know who it was. It was YouTube. Anyhow, but Peterson, I think rightly questions that YouTube feel the need to censor this. Which is he's just having a discussion with a woman on a topic, that they feel the need to censor that rather than letting people decide for themselves. Would it not be better, if YouTube wished to support the trans movement, to let people watch Jordan Peterson and either decide that Peterson was a madman and stoke their fires and become more compelled to support the movement, or perhaps listen to Peterson and change their viewpoint on some of the points that he raises. In either case, I think that we should be letting people make those decisions for themselves. So while that's perhaps not a great thing for free speech, another announcement that was on Twitter today and from a judge in Missouri is that in the state of Missouri there has been a court case, Missouri versus Biden, and it is related to the federal government of America, of the United States, and the way that it has been censoring and influencing social media companies by working with social media companies, Twitter heavily in the past, Facebook, that type of thing. Clearly YouTube, I would suggest too, to enable the government to push a narrative and have its federal agencies work with social media companies to either censor or influence what's happening on those platforms. Now, the judge in this court case has ruled a halt on those activities of the federal government. The court has called it a massive attack on free speech. The judge noted that this looks like 1984 being the George Orwell book of a dystopian future where we have authoritarian tyrannical control. I remember reading through 1984, and the concept that was the most frightening to me in that whole book was I'm paraphrasing, but the section where they talk about outlawing the use of the word riot. And if they did that for a few generations, then they would have no rioting, because if people don't know the word, if they can't conceive of the concept because it's never been taught to them, then how can they formulate a sentence to ask someone and say, let's riot, if they've lost that word from their vocabulary? And to me, I just realized that that's a possibility, that if you do control the communication, the media and the population for a long enough period of time, you can remove words from our vocabulary and remove our ability to understand those concepts, because without those words, we can't form those concepts. Powerful book. Anyhow, the judge said this looks like 1984. The situation is dystopian, and that the feds have assumed the role of the Orwellian Ministry of Truth. So that court ruling just today, and this ties in with what many of you, because I'm sure many of you are on YouTube, you're also on Twitter, will probably have picked up on in the last week, is that Elon has introduced some limits on the number of tweets that you can view within a day. I think it's 6,000 if you have the blue check, it's 600 if you're just a regular, and it's maybe less if you're brand new. While originally this seemed like some problem that Twitter was having with its servers, what I've since learnt is that the reason that this is being done is that government agencies and some marketing groups have been scraping all tweets from Twitter and then taking that data, combining that or feeding that to AI software to be able to analyze that massive data and then be able to determine trends and terms and groups of people talking about topics that perhaps don't align with the current government narrative. And so they have been using that wealth of information and AI to then work with media companies or with bot farms where you create thousands or hundreds of thousands of fake accounts to go and influence people's discussions on Twitter, or to go and censor terms. So if they're working with someone like Facebook or YouTube and say, hey, we don't want people talking about whatever this topic might be, to go and censor that. So look, hopefully Elon has got the right goal in mind and is working towards retaining free speech on Twitter. Hopefully this court case here, which might start to stop government influence over what you can choose to read or what you can choose to post. Hopefully these things will grow, and we will see a shift away from authoritarian control and a shift towards free speech and the treating of people as adults, proper adults, who are able to understand that there are opposing viewpoints in the world, who are able to read these and see these without immediately fighting or starting ad hominem attacks upon people, who are able to recognize that sometimes you'll read something that you don't like, and that's just life. You don't have to stop everyone else from reading that. Now, I think free speech is important. I think freedom of thought, freedom of speech is very important. I might do a topic on this one day, because I think there are some areas that need, you need some thought there, and there need to be some boundaries. Clearly, the boundary, which I think everyone is aware of, is that when children are involved, then there needs to be some boundaries about what is said and what is shown. And this is purely because the children just have not developed yet physically or mentally or emotionally or socially to deal with all of the things that adults can and should be able to deal with. So anyhow, on that note, if you're still here, thank you. I hope you're enjoying the shows. If you are, please subscribe. I will keep these up. I'll be back in the next day or so with another update on Ukraine and possibly one on Kosovo too. Just want to see what's happening there. Okay, thanks.